we'll get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for European Policy Studies. My name is Zach Pakin, and I am a researcher in the EU Foreign Policy Unit here at CEPS. Thank you very much for joining us for what is certain to be a very thought-provoking and timely discussion on current political developments within Russia, particularly as it relates to this weekend's Duma elections and the potential trajectory that they might imply, not only for Russia's future political development, but also for EU-Russia relations and European security more broadly. We have four excellent panelists who are joining us today to discuss this topic, and 2021 has certainly not been a boring year for Russia-West relations, beginning as it did with protests within Russia surrounding the arrest of Alexey Navalny, continuing in subsequent weeks with High Representative Josep Borrell's visit to Moscow, which did not exactly go as planned, coinciding roughly with the extension of the New START treaty, a nuclear treaty between the United States and Russia. Continuing into the spring then with an unexpected military buildup of the Russian forces on the Ukrainian border, and of course a highly touted summit between the United States and Russian presidents in Geneva. We now go into this very interesting political cycle as we enter this fourth quarter of 2021 and start to think about what will be expected in the EU-Russia relationship and the broader Russia-West relationship into 2022. As I was mentioning, we've got four excellent panelists joining us today. First up, we have Mark Galeotti, who's joining us from London today, and he is the director of MIAC Intelligence, in addition to an honorary professor at UCL and a number of other affiliations. And he's also the author of a recent book on a short history of Russia. Good morning from Toronto. Good afternoon to you, Mark.
Hello there. Good to be here.
Hi. Oksana Antonenko is also with us today. She's joining us from Cambridge. She is a director at the Control Risks Consultancy, in addition to a visiting fellow at the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., and a member of the EU-Russia Expert Network, of which our research director, Stephen Blockmans, is also a member. Oksana, thank you so much for being with us. Spasiba.
Thank you for inviting me.
For sure. Leonid Rogozin joins us today from Riga. He is a freelance journalist based there, published widely and formerly a member of the BBC. Leonid, добрый день.
Добрый день. Hello. Thanks for having me here.
For sure. And finally, last but not least, Kadri Lik, a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and also a member of the EU-Russia Expert Network, joins us, I believe, from Berlin. Is that correct, Kadri?
Berlin, yes. Good afternoon.
Wonderful. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. So before we get into the situation within Russia, in terms of the political development of the country, I thought we would start off with a quick question over to Mark. I'd be remiss not to mention the Zapad 2021 exercise that has just concluded. And I'm wondering, Mark, if you could give our viewers and listeners any insight whatsoever as to what this recent military exercise might imply for the future of Russia's security posture. What should we in the West be on the lookout for in particular?
Well, to a large extent, actually, the honest answer is nothing particularly new. I mean, this is the most recent iteration of, after all, exercises that take place every 4 years on a rolling program. And although this looks as if it was slightly larger than the more recent one, essentially it followed the standard scenario, which is in the dastardly enemies who bear a striking resemblance to Poland and the Baltic states have stirred up trouble in a Belarus-style country And at first, there is the need to put down this attempt at enforced colored revolution and foreign hybridная война, hybrid war, followed by a solid counterattack, which is when it sort of moves into a much more conventional military phase. So the scenario is very familiar. What's different is obviously the context because of what's going on in Belarus. So this is very much an opportunity for Moscow to demonstrate that whatever its qualms about Lukashenko personally, it is solidly behind Belarus in, as they frame it, resisting foreign attempts at destabilization. It's an opportunity for Russia to slightly inch forwards with its agenda in terms of integrating Belarus's forces into its own. And perhaps most importantly of all is the overall kind of political message that is being put out, which is precisely stay away, keep your hands off us. I mean, although we may not recognize it, there is clearly a strong belief in the Kremlin, certainly amongst sort of Putin's inner circle, that Russia faces this insidious conspiratorial threat from a West that wants to, at best, marginalize and at worst, destabilize the current regime. And they're just more or less saying, we are more than the equal to this threat. So I think that's the context. I mean, if we're going to draw anything from it, it would just simply be that this kind of paranoia and defensiveness is still very much alive and well in the Kremlin.
Very good. Thanks so much for that update, Mark. And we'll come back to the Russia-West dynamic. Let's just go to Oksana next. If you could give us your read on what's going on in Russia right now in the lead up to this Sunday's election by any chance.
Well, thank you very much, Zach. And maybe I also want to add one small point to what Mark just mentioned about Zapad exercises. I think in addition to the context that you quite rightly described in Belarus kind of Russia relations, I think there is also a global context in which many of Russia's neighbors at the moment are quite nervous, observing what's happening in Afghanistan in particular, and to what extent we are seeing really downgrading of the US commitments around the world, and most importantly, of course, in Europe, and with attention being shifted very much to Asia. And this kind of muscle flexing in the context of really almost completely collapsed system of confidence building in Europe, be it the Vienna document or any conventional arms control, really shows to what extent the European security will continue to be quite an important agenda item for Washington and for NATO more broadly. I mean, this shift to Asia should not come at the expense of very important European security challenges. Now, I guess, shifting towards what's happening within Russia itself. Clearly, we used to be for many years, really observing what is happening in various Russian elections on the day of the elections itself, and with various continuous speculations about use of administrative resources, the fraud, the other manipulations. But nowadays, I think it is enough to really see what's happening preceding the elections themselves. So actually what is happening on a day or actually 3 days this year, because we are having now elections which are stretching over 3 days. And in fact, it's a very interesting system in which voters not only are allowed to vote, in a hybrid format, online or in person, but also are allowed to change their decision to re-vote almost infinite amount of time. So people can change their mind and re-vote again under the new system several times. So, what is actually happening on the day itself, it doesn't really matter because it's just very difficult to observe. And in fact, OSCE this year is not observing the day itself. But what was happening leading towards the elections, I think, is a very important trend, and which is now very clearly consolidated. The first one, of course, this is the elections that have taken place under the new constitution in a way, when the system has shifted now from, attempt to at least seek some sort of inclusive legitimacy to really very much the system of loyalty to the current regime. So there is really very little room at the moment to any opposition or any, pluralism, even in a limited way. Secondly, of course, it comes following quite a substantial crackdown, not only on the opposition parties, many of them are not opposition activists or Navalny supporters who are not registered, but also on the media. We have seen, all these various steps now, with many journalists and media outlets presented as foreign agents. And finally, of course, it comes at a time when there is a growing public discontent, also on the back of COVID pandemic and the economic consequences, when the living standards have been falling and people are really feeling very anxious, particularly people outside of the state economy, that are, what the future holds for them. And this public discontent perhaps is being managed by the various subsidies that the state has now offered, with various payments to military people, to pensioners, to be able to kind of soften that. But I think the interesting thing to watch now, what the large cities and the middle class is going to do in these elections.
Thanks very much, Oksana. And I just want to seize on this question of the opposition for Leonid, just to talk about the systemic opposition versus the non-systemic opposition. As Oksana was talking about, the recent political trajectory of Russia has made being a part of the non-systemic opposition a lot more difficult than it has been in previous years and decades within Russia. I was wondering if you could sort of dwell on that a little bit, about how these two different kinds of opposition forces are likely figuring in, strategically speaking, into this current election campaign, and what this might imply for Russia's future political evolution beyond the elections itself.
Well, I would say that since Putin came to power, and since people like Vladislav Surkov started building this political system as we know it now, all the effort was aimed at having a full control. So in simple terms, the presidential administration wanted to control not just its own constituency, but all the other constituencies as well. And therefore, they were keen on creating their own communists, their own far right, their own nationalists, and to have the finger in every pie, and manually controlling all of the political forces, being the super mega puppeteers in Russia. So that system, it probably achieved its height around 2010, and then it began to collapse. And the reason for that is that the society continued to evolve. It continued paradoxically to get more westernized in its lifestyle, in its attitudes to the world, to life, in its understanding of the world. So we are dealing now with a mature society that basically is out of this, adolescence of the early 2000s, and it has largely outgrown the political leadership. So that's where this conflict between systemic and non-systemic opposition stems from. Non-systemic opposition are people who are mature enough to want to avoid being puppeteered by the Kremlin, and this constituency is growing larger and larger. And the demand for change in Russia is also growing larger. So we know from the polls that until 2017, stability was the buzzword, and people preferred stability over everything else. Since 2017, polls consistently show that people prefer change over stability. So that's what the Kremlin is dealing with now. Just to finish it, basically we're coming to the point where the Kremlin will have to recognize the existence of non-systemic opposition, maybe after this election, maybe a bit later, but we'll see how the smart voting will work out here in this election. But sooner or later, Kremlin will have to admit that these people exist.
Thank you very much, Leonid. Kadri, I hope you don't mind, before we get into the wider European dimension, I want to just pick up on this thing that Leonid mentioned about control and the desire of the Kremlin for political control or societal control. We've had this discussion before about the extent to which the regime has demonstrated its resilience multiple times over the course of the past 3 decades, to an extent far greater than many observers in the West would originally have given it the ability to have. How long can this sort of attempt at preserving control actually be preserved in the face of what Leonid calls an increasingly mature society, as it were?
I do not know. Maybe for a while more. It's always hard to predict. But I would argue that control comes with a price tag. actually, whenever you go to Russia, you can see how the political system is tired. It is leaking life and energy, and I don't think it can go on without renewing itself. So they might be able to fix elections, these ones, maybe next ones, but that all comes at the expense of its vitality. And especially it strikes me about, yes, the Russian society. In a way, we have sort of gone a full circle over the last 10 years. Maybe, I don't know how many remember, but we are actually nearing an interesting anniversary on 24th of September. That was the day in 2011 when Putin and Medvedev stepped onto stage and announced that they will switch back the positions. Putin will return to the Kremlin, Medvedev will return to become prime minister. And that launched the string of protests in Russia. And that was the moment when Putin lost the sympathy of Russia's urban intelligentsia. And that gave rise to all foreign agent legislation. And Russian civil society lost a lot of its Western funding, and some were forced to emigrate. However, what happened actually, and Leonid has actually been writing and talking about it, it really gave rise to indigenous civil society, organizations that are not funded by the West, that might not even be pro-Western in many aspects. They might disagree with the West quite strongly on certain things, but nonetheless, they are agents of democracy inside Russia. And so now, 10 years later, they got so dangerous that the Kremlin is actually shutting down them. I think the concepts are being stretched. You don't need to get foreign funding anymore to be labeled foreign agent, and you don't need to be foreign agent in order to be shut down. And sort of that dynamic shows to me that, yes, exactly, society is maturing, and the Kremlin better catch up with that at one point by renewing itself and the system, as otherwise it is facing a dead end, regardless of how masterful it is in cracking down and organizing elections. I think these elections are probably are happening in the most restrictive environment since probably 1980s and early 80s, not late 80s even.
Can I follow up with you, Kadri, on that? The regime needs to renew itself. What does renew itself tangibly mean? Like how much of a fundamental shift from the status quo would that necessitate?
I think that takes a signal from President Putin as to when he intends to go and how he intends to go. By how, I mean, will he appoint a successor? Will he rearrange political systems so that power is distributed in different centers of power, be they institutions, be they, I don't know. That is clearly the signal that Russia's political system is waiting. They have been waiting actually ever since 2018. You could see how they expected to get some clarity after the presidential elections. And when none came, frustration was palpable, and not just among the society, but among the elites, because they have their own plans, career plans, social mobility, but the system is stuck because the man at the top has not given any indication as to how long he will stay and how he will leave.
Thanks very much, Kadri. And just a reminder to our audience, those who are joining us right now, feel free to pose your questions at any point in time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to your questions as appropriate throughout the discussion. Mark, back over to you. The last Duma elections took place somewhat in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea and during the reign of what some people have called the Crimean Consensus, which lasted about, I suppose, 4.5 years after the annexation of Crimea, in which Vladimir Putin's approval ratings went through the roof. However, these Duma elections are taking place under very different political circumstances within Russia. United Russia has been polling in the 30s for quite some time now. And so I'm wondering, what's your take on that in terms of what we can expect in the aftermath of these elections, seeing as it's clearly going to be a very different political aftermath to these elections as it was to the previous one?
Sure. Well, we have to start by being sort of brutally aware of actually how little these elections mean on one level. The state Duma is not solely a rubber stamp institution, but to a considerable extent, it is essentially a part of the overall theatricality of the political system. This is still a highly presidential and above all administrative system. So yes, we're almost certainly going to see United Russia still somehow manage to scrape its constitutional majority, its 2/3 majority. Not really because it needs to, because even if it wants to make constitutional changes, it can rely on support from the systemic opposition. But I think simply because for a Kremlin that seems desperate to seem strong, or at the very least avoid looking weak, if it lost that constitutional majority, it would be interpreted as a sign precisely of fading grip. So I think what we're going to be looking for is, yes, on the one hand, there will be clear continued draining. I mean, I think Kadri put this very well in terms of the bleeding of the vitality, the energy, and also the legitimacy of the regime, which matters, but not in an immediate way, because the interesting thing is we still actually have a very strong, and some would actually say quite dynamic administrative regime. I mean, Prime Minister Mishustin clearly has built a much more powerful administrative center. He's clearly tasked with at least some kind of delivery of the promises made to the Russian people, and clearly because the clock is ticking before the 2024 elections. And again, assuming Putin stands again, there's no question of the outcome. But this is a regime which would rather not, or rather, it would rather limit the extent to which it has to use out and out vote rigging and forgery of the results. It wants to close that gap because, particularly as it saw in Belarus, when the gap is insultingly wide, as happened there, then there is always the risk that it sparks some wider conflagration. So, I mean, in terms of what I think we're going to see is, on one level, the honest answer will be not a lot. We will see a new Duma, there will be some new faces, there will probably be a few more opposition figures there than before, but nonetheless, they will not have any particular sort of significance and impact, and life will continue. However, at the same time, I think everyone is indeed conscious of a sense of the sort of the draining strength of the political consensus behind the Kremlin. I mean, it really has moved into a situation where it's trying to convince people not that it is the right regime, but that any kind of change would be unwelcome, impossible, or downright dangerous. Better the devil you know. Well, when that is your main legitimating principle, then clearly you're already in a fairly weak position. I think, though, we will see much more emphasis on trying to convince the Russian people, hopefully with actions, but if need be, with just rhetoric, that things are actually changing. That even though everyone can feel the pinch, well, unless you happen to be an oligarch, everyone has felt the quality of life diminish and so forth. Nonetheless, something will start changing, because precisely, I think this is all about 2024, not these elections.
Understood. Can we just go to Leonid right now? How responsive do you think the regime has actually been to voters' ordinary concerns? This sort of picks up on Mark's response that he just gave right now. We've seen Sergei Shoigu and Sergei Lavrov, the defense and foreign ministers, respectively, appointed to the United Russia list, even for these elections. Does that sort of point towards a regime that is engaging mostly in cosmetic sort of a cosmetic approach to trying to make it seem as if it is responding to voters' concerns, or is there actually, a genuine, shall I call it, a majoritarian consensus, as it were, that the regime, to a certain extent, still embodies, thanks to not just its image, but also tangible socioeconomic and foreign policies that it has pursued?
I think this regime is really obsessed about feedback. And this obsession with feedback, it is what replaces democracy in Russia, which strives to achieve the same effect as democracy. So in terms of what the regime is doing, yes, the quality of life is deteriorating if we look at at the GDP per purchasing service, at salaries, and so on. However, that's just one side of things. What the Kremlin has been investing ever since the end of the Crimea cycle, because they managed to achieve this huge popularity by occupying Crimea, and then the Crimean bubble burst around the pension reform, I guess, in 2018, when effectively the citizens of Russia had to pay for this military adventure in Ukraine. So what Putin and his government came up with is major infrastructural projects, and what they're doing it quite efficiently, as far as I know. And from my experience, my fairly extensive experience of traveling around provincial Russia, is that they are changing, improving urban environments. And everybody who is familiar with Soviet urban environments, they know that they are quite inhumane. It's one of the things that bothers people most. So when they, while the salaries, while the income is falling, when they're changing the urban environments where majority of Russians live, it's a highly urbanized country, more urbanized than European Union on average. When they're doing it, they are actually improving the quality of life, and this is very tangible. It's hard to assess to which extent the improvement, what they have achieved, how much they have achieved in terms of this improvement. But it is very tangible in places that used to be fairly underdeveloped. I traveled to Siberian cities. I traveled to Volgograd quite recently. All of these places were considered to be really underdeveloped, and people were running away from there to Moscow and to St. Petersburg. Now it's quite a different environment. So that's important to notice. So basically, to attract, to mobilize its constituency, the Kremlin is doing two things at the moment. One is foreign policy. And that targets a very specific part of Russian society, the part that is irredentist, the part that is probably in age term is older, people for whom this unity that existed between Russians and Ukrainians and other people in the Soviet Union, for whom it still matters for personal reasons. But in terms of targeting the younger and wealthier constituency, they are investing a lot in improving urban environments and the transport system in Russia. And they have achieved quite a lot in these terms.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. Oksana, over to you. Putin has consistently outpolled the popularity of, at least personally speaking, of many other individuals associated with the regime, as well as the United Russia Party itself. Certainly his polling numbers are not what they used to be, but nonetheless, he does continue to outpoll the wider regime, as it were. So I'm wondering if, based on what Mark and Leonid have mentioned so far, whether or not you can speculate a little bit about whether Putin still does embody, at least himself, some sort of a genuine majoritarian consensus within Russia right now, or whether the time for that has even passed at this point.
Well, I think it is very difficult to judge about the real approval rating for Putin, because people, of course, in the current very restrictive environment, perhaps are a bit more cautious when they ask by pollsters, what their support, whether they support Putin. Of course, they tend to be, more positive than when they ask about support for United Russia. So it is difficult to know the credibility of some of those polls. But at the same time, clearly there is now a very strong constituency supporting the current regime, and these are the people who are supporting kind of the state, the rent redistribution system, which of course, if we look at Russia's political economy and kind of evolution of Russia's political economy over time, when Putin returned to power as president after Medvedev, clearly the economy of Russia has become at that time a bit more diversified with, the real private sector, with some investment, with some creative industry, with some more, genuinely independent entrepreneurial middle class emerging across the country. And these are the people who went into the streets in 2011, 2012, and demanded what, Leonid mentioned, sort of slightly more, or not slightly more, but substantially more, freedom, but also competitiveness, openness, rule of law. Since that time, this constituency has really shrunk substantially because the Russian economy has become since that time very substantially dominated by the state, both state-owned enterprises, the companies, Leonid mentioned here, large infrastructure projects. A lot of Russian economy is driven now by the distribution of those state funds and rents, and very little independent sector is there, non kind of state-related economy, because there is very little foreign investment. There is very little. The small and medium-sized enterprises, in particular, has really declined substantially as a proportion of the economy. So the Russian middle class, which tends to be, more looking for, freedom, competition, rule of law, competitive politics, accountability. This middle class is mostly now formed out of the people who are benefiting from the state, in one way or the other, from the state economy, from state system, and therefore, unless we're going to see substantial change in kind of political economy model, I think seeing this kind of more substantial and structured, opposition to the current system, it will be very difficult to see that emerging. But of course, the Russian economy is facing quite a substantial challenge over the course of the next 10 years, potentially less, because of this energy transition and the green economy, which is emerging, something which been accelerated substantially by COVID, and something to which Russia is not yet fully adjusted or even accepted and internalized and understood what it really means in terms of the kind of likely and rapid deterioration in that rent economy that they've been relying on. And so far, we have seen no evidence, and these elections are very unlikely to show it any indication that, despite of Mishustin's, efforts to implement some technocratic reforms, that Russia is seriously preparing to a new economy, to the economy in which it will not be able to rely on the export of oil and gas to be able to finance that large state sector. And that, in combination with rising popular discontent, will be a challenge for Putin as he approaches 2024.
Thanks very much.
Could I add a little PS on Putin's ratings? I think there's a fascinating dilemma here, because Putin's approval ratings, which, as you say, have indeed crept back down, still are at levels which any Western politician would happily trade their own grandma in for. But on the other hand, his trust ratings tend to be only about half that. Now, either that means that there is a substantial cohort within the Russian population who actually want to have a dishonest president, or, as is more likely, in some ways, there's two Putins that people are talking about. There is Putin the politician, and in a way that is reflected by the trust ratings. What do you actually think of his management of the economy, of management of the country, and so forth? And then there is Putin, the avatar, the icon of Russia. Because I think this is it. He has been, essentially the single fixed point around which the constellations of Russian politics have revolved now for 20 years. And so in some ways, you can approve of Putin almost just simply as a statement of patriotism as much as anything else. But I think actually the real approval ratings that we should be thinking about are, as I say, only really about half that. And what they show is that the coalition of the fed up is actually really quite substantial. The problem is that they have nowhere to go. They have nothing to do, or not until yet. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Navalny was dangerous, but that's a whole other issue.
We might not necessarily get into that just yet, but let's since we've already gone about half an hour in, let's start to connect the domestic into the international now. And I'd just like to start with Kadri on this front. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Russia's psychological orientation, as it were. I know this is a topic that is of interest particularly to academic minds, but I know that you've written as well on sort of the generational shift within the Russian elite, and the fact that the last sort of offended generation, as it were, is on its way out, the baby boomer generation, which genuinely saw the West as its primary psychological orientation point, and that future generations might just view the West as one pole among others. So I'm wondering, based on your analysis here, your existing writings on that topic, do you think it's possible, and also based, of course, on the political evolutions within Russia that we've been discussing for the first half an hour so far, is it possible to imagine at some point in the near future or medium term some sort of European Russia emerging still at this point? And by that, I don't mean, a Russia that conforms fully to the norms of the European Union. I mean, a Russia that is still genuinely oriented towards Europe. Is that going to remain sort of the fixed point that will inspire some sort of change within Russia, both in terms of its domestic policies and its foreign policies over the medium term? Or rather, is this really a genuine rebalancing now that we've seen in recent years towards Eurasia, or at least a pivot towards itself away from Europe? Is this Eurasianist discourse something that is actually genuine, or is it, it's just sort of the obsession of the elite right now? Could you help us understand those complicated dynamics?
Well, there are many things in that question. Well, I think one thing that is clear is that Russia is a European country. I mean, culturally, history-wise, I don't think that will change. I mean, it's a strange European maybe, but still a European. That said, I think they sort of pivot away from seeing Europe or West as its primary focus is also real. And it's largely also objective, because if you look at power balances in the world, the rest is gaining at the expense of the West. They are gaining power, money, GDP numbers, etc. So it's quite logical that also Russia should look elsewhere. Another thing is that Russia is quite uncertain as to the political developments in the West. I mean, they are not quite convinced what will happen to the European Union. Is it there to stay at all? Was the UK the first country to leave, or was it also the last? Will Europe get its act together as coherent political actor? Will it manage to adapt to a world where its values are not expanding but shrinking? All these are big ifs for Moscow, as actually there are questions that also Europe should be asking much more seriously. And likewise about America, America will of course still be a big power, superpower maybe, but not so super as it was a decade or two ago. So there is an adaptation there too. So Russia is looking at all these developments in the world, and I think lately many people have been arguing that given the flux that the world is in, we shouldn't invest in any long-term relationships. I mean, especially during COVID, to the extent I managed to follow Russian debate, self-isolation emerged as a new buzzword there. And I don't think it was sort of entirely propaganda. I mean, there was thinking behind it. And that's why I don't think that that there is sort of major unlocking of relationship in Europe happening in near term, certainly. Medium term, who knows? And what do we even mean by that? But for now, I think Russia just, given that Russia is in movement, Europe is in movement, world is in movement, and you cannot lock a relationship between two moving targets against moving background, as one Russian analyst told me. I think we will be in a wait and see position, and especially with Europe, because Europe doesn't have sort of short-term agenda with Russia, quick fixes like the US had. US really had agenda that made sense, even in current fluid circumstances. Strategic stability is something that both America and Russia wanted to get started, and they could agree on it. But the sort of European summit with Russia floated by Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron in the summer, I was astonished that they even came up with it. And of course, it met resistance. Part of it political, stemming from that orthodoxy that we shouldn't be talking with Russia until Russia starts behaving. But partly, I think it was completely reasonable because Europe truly doesn't have any agenda with Russia right now. So I think that after the elections, it could be that the political climate eases up a little bit. Maybe, Russia that has been quite paranoid actually about Europe before the elections, seeing Europe as being behind Navalny, and that's not justified at all. I think Europe has done minimum acceptable, but Russia has sort of kept Europe at sidelines. Probably after the elections, there could be talk on certain files, and climate might be one, but nothing comprehensive, nothing, Europe likes these sort of big framework relationship strategies, etc. We won't get that from Russia, at least nothing credible. I don't think that can be done.
Thanks very much. It's very helpful. Follow up for Leonid. Sorry, Oksana, you wanted to get in on something there?
Yes, maybe just to follow up on Kadri's, I think excellent remarks, but just to maybe say that there is a distinction, and we should draw a distinction between Russia's attitude towards the European Union. And I entirely agree with Kadri how Russia continues to portray and believe that the European Union is on the way down and is kind of weakening, and its future is uncertain. And the relationship with some key European powers, which is, not exactly at that strategic level, of course, as with the United States, and not from the kind of the league of superpowers, but it is a relationship which is nonetheless really important because it touches on a much broader set of interests for Russia going forward beyond strategic stability. Of course, Russia is still interested in continuing its energy relationship with Europe, and therefore this emphasis on the Nord Stream 2, on this latest summit with Angela Merkel is really very important for Russia, because it is still an agenda which is almost existential for Russia's economy, because should Europe decide going forward that it would not want to replace Russia's oil and gas imports with similarly extensive cooperation on other energy sources like hydrogen, for example, in the future, Russian economy is going to experience very substantial economic challenge, because it will not be able to diversify or shift really its energy relationship entirely from Europe to Asia. And secondly, I think there is still a very large number of Russians, including Russians that are very influential and integrated within the system, who see Europe as an important, cultural, economic, educational, and kind of soft power counterpart. We still see Russians being the largest number of recipients of the Schengen visas. There's still a lot of Russians who are traveling to Europe. And in fact, this summer, when Europe closed its borders because of COVID, there's been a very substantial impact, I think, on the way that the Russians finally understood, or talked about, what the impact could be, if they're not able to travel to Europe. And there's been, obviously, among this Russian middle class and people who are able to travel abroad, Europe is still very much a priority. And there's still a majority of Russians who want to travel and for education abroad. They tend to go to Europe, even though the numbers going to China are also increasing. So I wouldn't say that there is no agenda with Europe, and Europe is not influential, but maybe the European Union is a kind of a symbol, a depository of all the problems that exist in the relationship between Russia and Europe, still, of course, experiencing a lot of problems, and the possibilities for selective engagement are probably going to be even less after these elections.
Understood. Thank you very much. Before we move into that, before we get into the topic of EU-Russia relations specifically, I just have one quick follow-up for Leonid on Putin, who has written quite a bit in recent months about Ukraine in particular, and his understanding of its historical role as part of the Russian nation. My take, feel free to disagree, but my take is that these are not just cynical perspectives, but this represents his genuine understanding of history. The fact that, Russia has effectively been robbed of its historical and spiritual unity with Ukraine, thanks to the West, thanks to the Bolsheviks, thanks to take it what you will. If that's the case, if you have a Russian elite right now that is still oriented towards this notion of unity with Ukraine, does that not point to a Russia that remains psychologically oriented towards Europe, rather than, let's say, pointing, towards Eurasia increasingly, as many in the regime or many thinkers associated with the regime, the Sergei Karaganovs of this world, et cetera, would have you believe?
I think in terms of Putin's article about Ukraine, here we're dealing with the work of spin doctors who are obsessively trying to recreate the Crimea effect in Russia, and they're probing public opinion. But as this year showed, as well as this Duma campaign showed as well, and all of this happened as part of Duma campaign. That's important. It showed that no, there is no appetite for it. There is no other Crimea. I guess if Odessa were closer to the Russian border, Odessa could be sold to the Russian population in the same way as Crimea, as a really Russian city with Russian history. But Odessa is far in the west, so it's not even feasible. And nothing shows appetite, like huge appetite in Odessa itself for reunification with Russia. Yes, I think they try to play this irredentist card, but people have moved away from 2014. People want other things. So it is talking about Ukraine. The Kremlin can achieve two things. One is to mobilize this shrinking constituency, the irredentist constituency. The other thing is, and this is probably more important, Ukraine serves as this major boogeyman for Russian society. It is a way for the Kremlin to show people what will happen to them if they choose the path of revolution, if they choose a path of closer relations to the West, in which the West probably will not be as sincere as it tries to present itself. And basically, this is the narrative of going back to the 1990s, because Ukraine, in its current form, in its when it is still a country that is controlled by corrupt oligarchs, controlled by the mafia state, essentially, it looks like Russia in the 1990s, and that's a major deterrent for Russians who consider moving the way Ukraine went. Regarding your question on whether that represents Russia's sort of European pivot, I mean, first of all, as Kadri mentioned, Russia is a European country, and in many ways, because it is a peripheral European country, it is in many ways more European than countries that have Chinatowns in their capital cities. If you conduct a poll in Russia, how many people tried Beijing duck? I think the number will be well below Western Europe, and probably below other countries in Eastern Europe that are part of the European Union. Europe is the only cultural reference point for Russians. If you analyze what kind of childhood books people read when they grow up, what they're being taught at school, Europe is always the main reference point. And it is also the adult in the room for Russians. Russians as society and Russian government, it always acts as this, teenager that has been kicked out of the house and does all the naughty things outside. But really, all they want is to be accepted. I think the last thing that needs to be said here is that because of the Soviet Union experience, And the Soviet Union was this totalitarian post-imperial project that existed in the large part of the world. And it was driven largely by idealism after the collapse of old world empires. So you shouldn't discount the fact that Russians and also Ukrainians in places like Donetsk or Crimea, and people in the breakaway regions of Georgia, these people are not really Russian nationalists. These people are unionists. And so there is this potential in Russia and among people who are often dismissed as Soviet, Homo Sovieticus. There is a great potential for rapprochement with the European Union, because the idea, the main idea in their thinking is the same as behind the European Union. It is not having borders with the neighbors. It's living in one large united space. So that's the resource for the European Union, if it is clever about it, to try and get political advantage and advantage in relations with Russia.
Gotcha. Regarding the point of a Chinatown in Moscow, let's not forget that there is a Kitai Gorod in downtown Moscow, but that's another story, of course. Over to Mark. We've got 40 minutes left, and I'd like to devote them to the question of EU-Russia and Russia-West relations, and to people's questions as well, of course. So Mark, Josep Borrell traveled to Moscow back in February and raised the issue in his private meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the situation of Alexey Navalny, who was in prison at the time. Suffice to say, it did not go well. And the central message basically out of Moscow in the wake of that trip was, we're not interested in discussing anything related to our own internal affairs anymore. That is no longer a legitimate topic for our bilateral relationship. However, says the Russian regime, we are interested in talking about areas of mutual interest where we have shared interests, where we can cooperate. I'm wondering how genuine do you think that actually is? Is Russia still genuinely interested in cooperating with the European Union in those areas of shared strategic interest? Or rather, does Russia now actually have an interest in weakening and delegitimizing the European Union in an era of great power rivalry and shifting global norms, et cetera?
Well, I mean, first of all, just to start with supporting that, the point we've heard already is that absolutely Russia regards itself as being a European country. But this is the interesting thing. It is of Europe, but not in Europe. In some ways, not entirely unlike the United Kingdom these days. And in that context, there is a clear sense of particular dissatisfaction in Russia about how the European Union treats it. There is this sense that it is being taken to a higher standard than other parts of the world. And in some ways, I mean, in a way, it's a glib analogy, but disputes within families can always be that much more vicious than any others, precisely because there is some underlying assumption, unspoken, that they ought to be getting along. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when they feel hard done by, it's felt that more keenly. And certainly, the Russians will say, and it's more than just simply a propaganda talking point, that the European Union, the West as a whole, treats Russia very differently from, say, Saudi Arabia or China. These are places that sort of definitely are seen as properly foreign, and therefore, well, what's a million Uyghurs in re-education camps compared with one dissident? Now, again, I'm not, I really should stress, I'm not endorsing that particular point of view, but that is, I think, something that is genuinely held in Moscow circles. And you've got to add to that the fact that, I mean, to be slightly glib, I'm not entirely convinced that the Kremlin believes the European Union really exists in the sense of as a genuine political structure over and above just simply being an agglomeration of nations. I think they see the European Union much more just simply as an arena in which powerful European countries, now primarily Germany and France, compete for authority, compete for the capacity to basically exert hegemony over other nations, which maybe is precisely how Russia would be if Russia was part of the EU. So, I mean, in this context, they certainly are not, from their point of view, going to be lectured about their domestic affairs. They have this very, very sort of primal concept of sovereignty that more or less says, where our borders start, your influence ends. Secondly, they see no reason to have to genuflect to the European Union. Quite the opposite. It is often the convenient whipping boy. I mean, when they went out of their way, frankly, to humiliate Josep Borrell, it was actually as a wider statement to other countries that, look, we are not going to put up with this kind of thing, but it's safer to give Brussels a kicking than, say, Berlin, let alone Washington. Does that mean that they're not at all interested in talking? No, I don't think so for a moment. I mean, yes, they're perfectly comfortable with undermining the European Union, because anything that creates more division within the West, anything that in some ways accelerates what they see as this inevitable return to essentially a world of bilateral relationships, in which Russia will often be, after all, the strongest partner. I mean, Russia versus the European Union is very different from Russia in its interactions with individual European countries. They're happier with bilateral relationships. So yes, they're perfectly comfortable to see the European Union in crisis, but they're also pragmatic. They will talk with whatever. The problem is, in a way, they're not sure really what they can talk about with the European Union. As we've heard, I mean, the value of talking to the Americans is actually under Joe Biden. There was a clear sense of what the Americans, in effect, wanted and what they were willing to offer. Nice, straightforward, transactional, bilateral, pragmatic relations. That is meat and drink for the MFA and the Kremlin. When you come to the European Union, it is in some ways a totally alien beast. First of all, it does very much stress this notion of a value-based policy that one can argue how often it really is genuinely value-based, but it means that the language of policy is one that is alien to the Russians. Secondly, I mean, concepts like this notion of the European Union as a regulatory superpower. I mean, I honestly think that does not compute in Moscow. I mean, their view is, okay, well, here is a T-14 tank. How are you going to regulate that, mate? It's a much more kind of traditional notion of what makes power. And so I think at the moment, the problem is that they are willing to talk where there are issues of mutual interest. But I really think, although there are smart people within the MFA and elsewhere, but if we're talking about the actual top leadership who really make the decisions, and that's not Foreign Minister Lavrov, I mean, he's very much lost a lot of traction with the Kremlin. Those people like Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev, people like Putin himself, I don't think that they really know how to talk to the European Union.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that. Let's actually follow up on that right now for Kadri on something that you've already mentioned about the previous attempt by Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel to reach out to Russia in advance of the recent EU Council meeting and why that failed. Could you dwell a little bit on why the Geneva summit between Biden and Putin is viewed somewhat as a success, whereas the EU sort of initiative, or at least the initiative, the Franco-German initiative, I should say, failed? And beyond that, you mentioned before that sort of a wider ranging, grandiose framework on the part of the European Union for relations with Russia is certainly no longer possible, but is some sort of initiative on the part of the EU eventually still possible or even warranted at this point in time, even if it's of more limited scope? And what might such an initiative potentially look like?
Well, why was Biden success? I think Biden showed to Russians that he manages to pick his fights and prioritize. That was quite amazing and very nice, actually, to see how respect towards Biden went up in Russia. If you follow the sort of Telegram channels of informed people, you could see the conclusion was that let's not underestimate him. He might be old, he might stumble every now and then with legs or words, but nonetheless. And of course, what Biden did, instead of sort of going with a full laundry list of disagreements from, press freedom, interference, Navalny, everything. He had a clear list of things that he wanted done. Talks about strategic stability, list of critical objects that must not be succumb to cyber attack. And that was also smart because, cyber treaty would not have been achievable. Otherwise, Russians actually would have wanted agreement on cyber issues with the United States. But that is impossible because the two understand completely differently what constitutes interference in internal affairs, for instance. For Russians, American democracy promotion would fall under it. For America, Russia Today would fall under it, but for Moscow is free media, etc. You would sort of end up in endless debate. But sort of list of objects that was clear, understandable. So I truly think that Biden actually handled it very well. And furthermore, I think he was maybe the first post-Cold War US president that had sort of realistic take on Russia, realistic take on what can be achieved in principle at this moment. So I highly applaud. Europe is not there. I mean, Europe, we don't do strategic stability talks. That file is handled by America. That is simply the case. It's stupid to dispute it, and we don't. We can't. I don't think we can sort of give a list of red lines either. And yeah. And there are these normative differences that really come into play very strongly. Europe cannot get over them because, Europeans have come together on the basis of some normative notions. You just cannot go very far from them, even if you want. And, a good illustration is we have a common interest with Russia. That could be a quick fix. We both want to see Lukashenko gone from Belarus. Europeans and Moscow are absolutely of the same mind on that. And yet it's impossible for us to cooperate on that because we have completely different notions on how it should happen and what should follow it. Should it be, free elections? Should Belarus be free to choose their geopolitical alliances after that? So, even where there is that communality of interest, I don't think that we still can cooperate. So as said, I think after the elections, I guess there could be some intensification of contacts on certain files. And climate would be one, because that is one that interests Russia. That is also one where the European Union really is rule-making power in ways that affect Russia. I mean, CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, is something that Russian businesses do take seriously. And Russia doesn't dispute European regulatory power where it exists, like trade issues, etc. But Mark is very, very right that they don't see Europe as sort of policymaker of highest caliber where it comes to security issues and the like. And I think that's going to be like that for a long time, partly because of Europe. We haven't delegated these powers to European institutions, but partly also, because very few people in Russia can navigate diplomatically the European policymaking field. Very few of them have the sort of good feel for the different balances, trade-offs, what does it take? Many of them think it's much more crude. I mean, it really takes a seasoned diplomat or good expert to understand the European Union.
Gotcha. One more question for Oksana, and then we're going to, I'll let you follow up as well, but just to follow up on that, I guess, as well, if you can include in your response, is it possible now, based on the evolving relationship between the EU and Russia in terms of the rival norms, rival visions of European security, and increasingly, divergent values in political systems now, is it possible to imagine a pragmatic relationship between the EU and Russia taking root in the coming years? Go ahead, Oksana.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I will also follow up a bit of what Kadri said and Mark to some extent of how Russia is perceiving the European Union. I think in addition to the energy sector and CBAM and the green energy transition, which, as I mentioned before, is extremely important topic and something where cooperation is absolutely necessary, although Russia is also talking about challenging CBAM in WTO process, and President Putin has several times presented CBAM and green energy transition from the EU as a way to of kind of unfair competition and protectionism as opposed to normative power. But on the security side, I think there are now increasingly a number of areas where EU and Russia or Europeans in Russia, I mean, I think maybe not the EU as an institution, but many Europeans in Russia would have to at least have a dialogue. That of course is the Iranian nuclear deal where, Europe and Russia are on the same page. And now after the elections in Iran, clearly it is going to be a more challenging process of returning back to the JCPOA. The second point is Libya, where Russia is a player, increasingly a player, perhaps not only in the diplomatic sphere, but more through the use of various, military resources that Russia has deployed there. And clearly it is the area where United States is much less present and interested in finding or, being part of the managing the crisis and solution than Europeans. And now Mali, for example, Russia is increasingly being active in Africa, in the areas where Europeans, French in particular, but others as well, are looking to strengthen their capabilities in Sahel, and Russia will be a player there. So, I mean, we have a number of areas, and of course, the whole area of Syria and a further, sort of Syrian endgame, which will have an implication, of course, for Europe to a large extent in terms of, refugees and other potential, insecurity. So there is a number of areas where this kind of selective engagement, or at least selective dialogue between Europe and Russia, is not only possible, but actually mutually beneficial. But again, whether European Union will be the medium through which this dialogue is going to take place, I mean, I doubt it very much, because there doesn't seem to be a framework, within the European Union, which is, really at the moment functioning as the dialogue platform. But individually, European states, France and Germany, but potentially others, Italy, on Libya and others, are going to play a role. And I think I certainly foresee, strengthening of this kind of dialogue going forward. Zach, sorry, I forgot which question did you ask me also to as a follow-up?
Well, I think you've covered it in your response, actually.
Yeah, okay.
So let's just move on quickly. I have one question for Kadri, and then in our final 20 minutes, I'm just going to dwell on audience questions and a couple of hot button topics that we'll get to. So Kadri, over to you. Those of us in Brussels are very eagerly awaiting developments as it relates to the EU strategic compass. So I'm wondering if you could help us understand, in your view, where you think Russia actually fits in to the European Union's strategic interests overall. Is this a first-tier issue for the European Union? Is this only a second-tier issue as time goes on and as China becomes more powerful, for example? Help us to understand what should be the European Union's strategic priorities as this decade moves on.
Well, I think Russia remains important. It's a close neighbor, very contested neighborhood, I think we can say so. And yeah, all these feelings, as Mark was describing very correctly, we have been thinking that we should be able to get along with Russia. And likewise, Moscow has been thinking the same about us. And hence the sort of disappointment makes the relationship emotionally much more loaded than many other relationships. But I do not think the European Union can come up with a new Russia strategy anytime soon, for reasons that have been largely already mentioned. I mean, on Russian side, it's doubts about the overall viability of the European Union, reluctance to invest in any long-term relationships. uncertainty about Russia's own direction that stems from sort of domestic deadlocks and tiredness of the regime. All these hinder the Russian side. But on European side as well, I think there is a major adaptation to be had. European Union became a foreign policy actor, or sort of developed that ambition when our rules and norms were expanding in the world, and sort of spreading our rules and norms was the basic means of European foreign policy. And now that cannot be done anymore, our rules and norms are shrinking, we really need to adapt in a fairly major way. And I don't think we are there yet. So, so any sort of strategies that Europe can draft, I mean, I would actually recommend everyone to sort of try to be minimalist and modest, because I think some more time needs to pass before anything bigger and more comprehensive can even be thought of.
Okay, time for some rapid fire questions from the audience. A couple of questions for Mark, which I'll pose at the same time, if that's all right. One is, as Russia is busy extending its control over the information space online, what are the prospects for a so-called Great Firewall of Russia? And how can the EU help to provide a window for non-Kremlin information to the Russian people, and should it even do so? That's one question. A second question is from my colleague Eleonora Tafuro, who asks how Russia currently perceives the recent announcement of the AU-UK-US agreement, the Australia, United Kingdom, US security partnership in the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay, right. I will try and answer briefly, as much as that goes against the grain. In terms of information space, well, look, I mean, Russia is grappling with the fact that it cannot replicate China's model because of the very different nature of the architecture of its internet. And that's why it's having to use a whole variety of different, sort of, in some ways, more intrusive means of actually sort of identifying particular platforms and posts and so forth. And look, they are clearly putting a lot of effort and a lot of thought into this, as we've seen most recently, everything from using sort of lawfare, trying to, you know, as they have successfully, you know, compelled Western platforms to, for example, stop supporting Navalny's sort of app, all the way through to actually controls within the country. We must accept the extent to which, in some ways, what we're seeing is an imagination race. Is clearly that, you know, you also have a fairly tech-savvy country, but particularly, you know, younger generation opposition figures who are looking for different ways around it. The state will continue to try and sort of find it. This is one of the reasons why I have a very long-term ambition to write a book about Russia as seen through the lens of the cyberpunk science fiction genre, in which a kind of a crucial issue is, in fact, the constant struggle for power between, you know, the man and the street. And I think we're going to see this very much played out in the information sphere. So, you know, it's not going to just suddenly reach a point when the Kremlin has won. It is going to be a constant struggle. In terms of AUKUS, the new alliance, I think we have to distinguish between, as it were, the overt and the implicit message. I mean, overtly, of course, the Russians are not in any way going to undermine the Chinese position. I mean, they are being so solicitous about the Chinese these days, which is in itself, I think, a sign of tensions within the relationship. That's why they're actually feeling they have to tiptoe that much more. So on the whole, this is an easy opportunity to basically win some brownie points with Beijing by, again, talking about the sort of, you know, militarization of the Pacific and blah, blah, blah. However, at the same time, precisely because I think amongst many, not necessarily Putin, but certainly amongst many within the sort of the senior security and foreign policy and indeed business elites, there is growing concern about China. There is a sense that, unfortunately, while China is necessary today, tomorrow it may well be a much more serious challenge, militarily, politically, and economically, than the West. I think there is also a degree of cautious satisfaction. Anything that keeps Beijing occupied with the Anglo-Saxon world, anything that also provides you know, a potential buffer against Chinese expansion, that is potentially to the good. They obviously don't want to be sucked into any overt conflict, but actually on a covert level, I think there is a feeling that, well, I'll end with this, as one former general staff officer once told me, and this was, I think, 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, and he said, in 20 years' time, Russia's choice will have been either to become an ally of the West of some kind or a vassal of China of some kind. And I think that is the kind of thinking that also informs how they assess this alliance.
Okay, thanks very much. That's very helpful. Another question from the audience, and could both Oksana and Leonid chime in on this? We have an audience member who asks, what are the prospects for a resolution of some kind of the Ukraine crisis along the lines of, official or tacit Ukrainian neutrality, or some sort of Finlandization, as he puts it, which would allow both Russia and Ukraine the opportunity to develop closer relations with Europe, while also, providing substantial security guarantees to the Russians. What do you both think? Oksana first, and then Leonid.
Well, I think that kind of solution probably would have been discussed, many years ago before 2014. Now, after 2014, I think that kind of solution, at least in the foreseeable future, is not something which will be acceptable to Ukraine, nor will it, of course, be acceptable to many of the Ukrainian supporters in Europe and in the West. So I don't think that, that sort of holistic solution is what we are at the moment looking for, nor do we have a capability to negotiate that sort of holistic solution. Where I think the progress would need to be made is to really try to understand what to do with the Minsk agreements, something which, as you know, European Union sanctions are still linked to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. And yet there seems to be no one who is at the moment completely committed to those Minsk agreements, neither Russia nor Ukraine, although of course on the Russian side they keep on endorsing the Minsk agreements, but there is no sense that the durable ceasefire and demilitarization of Eastern Ukraine is something which is on the cards. So we really need to be looking for small steps to be able to really gradually bring more sustainable stability and security, and then think about holding the elections in an environment where it will be possible to deliver more international oversight on what's going on in Eastern Ukraine. But I'm afraid that I do not really see any prospect for relationship between Russia and Ukraine improving anytime soon, nor any prospects of this issue, the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's interference in Ukraine being downgraded in any way in the way that the West is seeing its relationship with Russia in the foreseeable future.
Thanks very much. Leonid, over to you.
Well, I think the Finlandization is what Zelensky's presidential campaign was largely based on. And it's interesting that he made this shift in the following years, and especially since the beginning of this year, away from something along these lines. I think generally it is very important for the relations between Russia, Ukraine, and the West, or all the three parties, is to remove the geopolitical component from this conflict in order to resolve it. And yes, Finland is a model that could be looked at, because what Ukraine needs really is not being a part of the Western Bloc, not being a part of NATO. It needs rule of law, it needs a proper judiciary, it needs a wealthy society. And Finland did achieve this during the Cold War, thanks to its arrangements with the Soviet Union. And the fact that Finland repelled the Soviet attack in the early 1940s, it also complemented to the Soviet agreement with Finland continuing to develop in its own way, but being geopolitically neutral. So that could indeed be a solution for Ukraine. And my suspicion is that when we come to the next elections in Ukraine, the person who will really want to be elected, be it the same President Zelensky or some other personality will appear by that time. They will inevitably, in order to get votes both in the East and in the West, as Zelensky did in 2019, they will have to again flirt with the same kind of contests and again promise some kind of solution and better relations with Russia. So I wouldn't put it away. It's a kind of inevitable solution that to which the parties in the conflict will come to one day.
Gotcha. One last question from the audience, and I think I'll direct this to Mark, and then we'll do one final tour de table on a couple of hot button topics. This final question from the audience, Mark, is will the 2024 elections in Russia and the inability of Russia to adapt to the green transition drive Russia's further engagement, or rather its desire to prolong conflicts and crises abroad in order to artificially bolster its oil and gas products?
Well, first of all, I mean, the 2024 elections, we still don't know what's going to be happening. We are presuming that Vladimir Putin will be standing, but, well, he's currently in COVID self-isolation. I mean, you know, anything from health and mortality through to he might find a successor that he's willing to put his faith in can happen between now and then. But let's presume that he's actually going to be standing then. Yes, obviously in that case, the economy matters, and to a large extent or to a heavy extent, that depends on hydrocarbons, though not as exclusively as is often kind of presumed. But on the other hand, this notion of conflict being stirred up in order to keep prices high, I'm actually very skeptical of the idea that Russia uses kind of aggressive operations in such a clearly instrumental way. You know, we also heard this about, well, the Syrian deployment, it's all about pushing refugees towards Europe and so forth. I mean, on the whole, Russia gets involved in conflicts for the same reasons as anyone else, because it feels it has essential interests at stake, because it's sucked in by a local ally or partner who is able to kind of manipulate the metropolis. And if that also leads to increased hydrocarbon prices, well, that's a plus. But the point is, it is way too complex an environment, I think, for them to try and sort of think, oh, well, we can effectively use military power and manipulation as a market mechanism. So, I mean, I think it's more than just simply that these are resources whose prices anyway tend to be especially prone to being influenced by kind of large scale and violent geopolitical incidents, rather than that sort of the cunning Russians are sitting there manipulating it.
Okay, final tour de Oksana, if you don't mind, we're running a little short on time, so if you can include your thoughts just in your final remarks here. Just a little tour de table. We preferred so far in this session to talk about the sort of bigger structural and strategic considerations at hand, but there are two hot button topics that I'd love for each of you just to weigh in on as quickly as possible, 90 seconds to 2 minutes if possible. Number one has to do with Nord Stream 2, hot button topic. How much of this is just a sideshow, or is this actually a very substantive issue that marks a significant rift or shift, in the relationship between Russia and the West in post-Cold War historical terms? And second of all has to do with the Navalny saga. What should we be on the lookout for as we move towards 2024 and beyond over the coming months and years? Is this something that is going to evolve slowly? And if so, what sort of factors should we be on the lookout for? Or rather, is this something that could change very, very quickly and on a dime? And therefore, again, what sort of wild card, black swan, call them what you will, factors should we be on the lookout for? So let's start with Kadri, over to Leonid, Oksana, and then we'll finish with Mark.
On Nord Stream, no, I don't think it's a sea change of any kind. And I actually think the importance of it has been overblown, actually, and over dramatized. So No. There are a few issues of substance that are related to it, but we don't have time to go into these. And Navalny, well, I would see if the Kremlin lets him come out of jail when his time is up, because it was, I don't remember right now on the top of my head when he's due out, but I think it'll be significant as to whether they let him out or they try to extend his jail term by adding sentences. And that would tell us a lot about how secure the Kremlin feels and many trends for future.
Gotcha. Unless I'm mistaken, I believe that his term was for 2 3/4 years, which would mean that he would be out just in time for the 2024 elections. But I don't know if that has changed. But feel free to correct me if anyone has information on that front. Leonid, over to you.
Yes, on Nord Stream 2, I would say that the most important thing from the Russian perspective is that Russians, including Russian liberals, I don't think they are convinced that the Western stand on Nord Stream 2 is moral, essentially, that it's not driven by commercial advantage and geopolitics. And this is partly because the story began long before 2014, long before Ukraine, and before Orange Revolution in Ukraine as well. This whole attempt to derail all Russian projects to bypass Ukraine, which were natural given that Ukraine became an independent country and Russia became an independent country and it had its own independent energy policy. So particularly those pipelines across the Black Sea, they were derailed, and the first projects were derailed by the United States and Western countries in the early 2000s before the first Ukrainian crisis. So that's important, separating the moral part and the geopolitical and the commercial part. On Navalny is, on the one hand, he can follow the plight of Khodorkovsky, become essentially a political nobody by the time he goes out of prison. And as we know, it's not just 2 years. They're preparing other cases against him, and his detainment might be prolonged. On the other hand, unlike Khodorkovsky, Navalny has a movement, a very powerful movement, the most powerful opposition political network that ever existed in Russia since 1991. Navalny looks more like Nelson Mandela. So there is a possibility, and it depends on those people in charge of Navalny's movement, on people like Volkov and Zhdanov and Sobol, on whether they can turn it into what ANC was in South Africa.
Thanks very much. Oksana, over to you. 90 seconds for your closing thoughts, if that's all right.
Yeah, okay. One point to make is that conflicts, just to follow up on the previous question, the conflicts, they do not really produce any benefits in terms of oil price. What we've seen recently, of course, during this crisis, that it's an agreement with other oil producers, like Saudi Arabia and OPEC, which actually delivered, increase in oil prices. But for Russia, it is a challenge because Russia is so dependent now on its, energy or oil income that it simply cannot afford continuing to suppress its production. And therefore, I think it is in this dilemma. On one hand, it needs high prices. On the other hand, it really cannot do it, through external policies. Quickly on Nord Stream 2, I think it is unfortunate that Nord Stream 2 has been so geopoliticized, but in reality, of course, the Nord Stream 2 will become less and less relevant as we're going to see, the green transition. And I actually agree here with, German government, with Angela Merkel, that functioning Nord Stream 2 actually gives much more leverage to Europe and over Russia rather than other way around. And final point in terms of black swans, I think the black swan for Europe this winter is a potential new gas crisis as we're heading towards, the cold weather with very, very low volume of gas stored in European, storage sites, and with, potentially very cold winter ahead of us. And if such gas crisis were to happen, I think that will have actually quite substantial geopolitical consequences for EU-Russia relations. So this is one of those black swans, or maybe it is a gray rhino.
Gotcha. A very, very chilling thought, pun intended. Mark, the final words go to you.
Okay, on Nord Stream, everything that needs to be said has already really been said, except for the fact that in some ways, actually, this was really a conflict between the United States and Germany, with Russia as the arena or the object for that. To focus on Navalny, look, I don't believe the Kremlin will be letting Navalny out so long as they regard him to be a threat. So either he'll be out in the context precisely of some presumably post-Putin attempt at national reconciliation. Again, here the Mandela parallel becomes apposite. Or else, really, actually, we have to accept that he himself is stuck behind razor wire. So really, the question will be who becomes the post-Navalny figure. I mean, there is this movement, there is this structure still, despite the best efforts of the state, and there is still this coalition of the fed up, who are at the moment a political movement in potentia. They're there waiting for someone to be able to activate them. Navalny came close, and that's why, as I said, he was dangerous. If it's not going to be him, who else is it going to be? It could be a nationalist, it could be a communist. We'll just have to wait and see.
A very fascinating thought on which to conclude. Thank you to all four of you for your very thought-provoking interventions. Reminder to our audience, feel free to consult our website at cept.eu, that's ceps.eu, for forthcoming events, as well as a list of our recent publications, including a couple from earlier this year by yours truly on the future of EU-Russia relations. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. Mark Galeotti, Oksana Antarenka, Leonid Rogozin, Kadri Lik. Thank you, spasiba, aite. A pleasure to be with all of you as always, and we hope to host you again soon.
Thank you.